Hej och välkomna till Garantums-studion och ett nytt fondporträttsavsnitt. I detta avsnitt så kommer vi fortsätta att fokusera egentligen på det alternativa tillgångslaget. Då har vi bjudit in Adrian Owens som är ansvarig förvaltare för GAM Global Rates. En makrotematisk absolut avkastande fond som lyckades under 2022 uppvisa en positiv avkastning på 15%. Ett år egentligen när både räntemarknaden och aktiemarknaden hade ganska röda siffror. Den här fonden är en fond som investerar i både valutor och även på räntemarknaden och drar nytta av marknadens ineffektivitet. Welcome Adrian, and thanks for coming. Would you please describe your fund? What is it? How do you manage it?
Sure. So we manage an interest rate and currency fund. We invest globally with a focus more on the more mature developed markets. Our objective is to try and generate typically high single digit type returns, but to do so in a way that typically exhibits a very low correlation with other managers, with equities and with bond markets.
Would you categorize this as an alternative fund, or how would you categorize it?
Yeah, different people seem to look at us differently. I think an alternative is a good way of categorizing the fund. I like to think of us in some ways as relative value macro by style. We do use some leverage. So again, we have been described as a hedge fund as well. And the fact that our return stream tends to exhibit a very low correlation with other markets. But yeah, hedge fund, absolute return, alternative, any of those labels really describe the fund.
Looking back at 2022, it was a rough year for both equities and fixed income, but you managed to have a positive return by the year end. How did you manage to do that?
Yes, I mean, clearly very difficult year for your more traditional asset classes. Of course, the big theme in 2022 was that inflation was proving more stubborn than many people had expected. And central banks, despite what they said at the beginning of the year, needed to raise interest rates by much more than many people had expected. I mean, our analysis had suggested that inflation would prove to be more stubborn, and the way that we generated a good return during that period was essentially, or the biggest driver, was positioning for higher interest rates from central banks. And most of those returns came from our positions in the US and in the UK. But in addition to that as well, we also made returns from these relative value cross-country trades. So long one country, short another. And the nice thing about those types of trades, again, is that they exhibit a very low correlation with markets more generally.
Yeah. And so you describe your fund as an alternative fund. How would you say it would fit into a total portfolio as an alternative fund? Why is it important to have it in the total portfolio?
Well, I mean, the main reason is that it's a fund that can give you an alternative income stream. As you highlighted in 2022, it was a very difficult year for bonds and equities. The fund performed strongly. We also actually had a very good year in 2008 during the financial crisis, when your traditional equity markets came under a lot of pressure. 2018 was a year where 90% of all asset classes lost money. Again, we had a positive year during that period. So I think that's the main reason. I mean, I would probably add in one other as well, and it depends on people's views on where markets are going. But the last couple of years have been quite difficult in terms of returns to capital. And I think we are going through a period where we're seeing a reallocation a little bit more back towards labour. Wage growth is much stronger. The demographics are not so supportive as they have been in the past. So I think going forward, we're going to see better returns to labour in the form of higher wages. I think returns to capital could come under more pressure. So again, your traditional 60-40 portfolio may just find over the next 2 or 3 years things are a little bit more difficult than investors have been used to. So again, having a fund that can perform potentially in that environment, because we can go long and we can go short, and is uncorrelated, I think this is really an ideal time for that type of strategy.
Yeah, looking historically, it's been really impressive looking back at those rough years. And I know you have been taking bets towards the Swedish krona and so on. And what's your view looking forward on the Swedish krona as it is as of now? Yeah.
Sure. I wouldn't use the word bets. They're investments based on a lot of analysis and a lot of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sweden is a market that we have been running short positions in. But I think potentially, at least in the near term, things look a lot more positive for Sweden. One of the reasons the krona has been under pressure has been that Sweden has had weaker growth than most of its peers over the last few years. So that's really not been very helpful. Of course, in an environment where globally the economy is responding to higher interest rates, that's not a great environment typically for the Swedish krona as well. However, that weakness in the currency is having an impact, and that is supportive for the economy on a longer term view, because obviously it loosens monetary conditions. So we're planting the seeds for an eventual turnaround in the Swedish krona. In the very near term, the fact that the authorities are hedging some of their currency reserves, I think provides a near-term support. As well, on top of that, of course, I believe a lot of investors had got quite short the Swedish krona because it had appeared to be something of a one-way bet. Mm-hmm. So over the short run, I think Sweden could do a bit better. On a slightly more medium term, again, I think, as I say, the seeds are beginning to be put in place for a bit of a turnaround. But, you know, we'll have to review the data over the next few months before we can feel a little bit more confident. So we've covered our short positions in Sweden. Currently we're neutral, but I suspect the next big move from us would be actually to start owning the Swedish krona and be long.
Very interesting. And as I see it, this is a great compliment to the portfolio. Really impressive.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, Adrian.
A pleasure.
Och tack för att ni lyssnade på det här fondporträttsavsnittet, och håll utkik för nya intressanta teman här framöver. Tack så mycket.